Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a string quilt block. These are very easy to make, probably one of the easiest quilting blocks you can make, so it's ideal for beginners. To make these blocks you need to have a foundation. In this case, on this one, it's an old piece of paper from a telephone directory. On this one it's a piece of muslin, and on this one, it's four joined together. On this one, it's a piece of cotton fabric. If you're using the cotton fabric or the muslin, they stay on the quilt. They don't get pulled off. But obviously, if you're using paper, when you've finished your blocks, you need to rip the paper off. So today, I'm going to be showing you how to make the string quilt block on the diagonal. There are many different ways you can do a string quilt block, but these ones that we're going to do today are sewn on the diagonal. I've used this method rather than the horizontal or vertical because it uses different lengths of fabric. So some of your lengths might be quite short, suitable for the corners. Obviously you use your longer ones for the centre, but I just think it works better when you're using up scrap pieces of fabric. So let's get started. You'll need some foundation, either papers or fabric. These need to be cut at 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. Choose if you want to use fabric or paper. You will also need some strips of fabric. They can be any width between 1 inch and, well, 2 inches would be the maximum. You can either do them all the same width, or as I have done, you can mix and match the width depending on your scraps of fabric. Then cut yourself some squares of fabric from either an old telephone book, or you can use some thin cotton fabric or some muslin. Cut these squares 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. To start, you will need a 6.5 inch square of thin cotton fabric. Then take a strip of fabric and place it across your piece of thin cotton fabric diagonally with right side facing up. So it's going to go from left hand top corner to right hand bottom corner. Try and centre it the best you can. Then if you like, you can pin this in place. I don't often bother, but for the purpose of this video I'm going to pin in place. Next, you will need to find strips of fabric to go either side of the one you've already put on your thin piece of cotton. Choose any random 2 pieces. Don't fuss about this choice too much. Just make sure that they're going to be long enough. At this point you can choose all your strips of fabric ready, but to begin with we'll just be sewing one either side of the one you've already pinned down. Then take your first piece of fabric and place it face down on the piece you've already pinned to your piece of cotton. And if you like, you can pin this in place. Not always necessary, but see how you feel. If you feel you need it to be pinned, then pin. Usually I don't bother, but as I said before, for the purpose of this video I'm going to be pinning. You could take this straight over to your sewing machine and sew, or to save time you could pin down the second side ready, so you can sew 2 at once. Entirely up to you, but I'm going to do just 1 at a time. So at my sewing machine I sew down the right hand side, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance and removing my pins as I go along. Now you can add your piece to the other side. So again we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to place our next strip face down over that middle one that we put on first and pin in place. And then sew in place, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing the pins as you go along. And then fold both your pieces open and then press in place. Now you can add another strip, 1 each side, and again we're going to place them face down over the previous strip. But make sure you cut them off to the right length first, of course, and then pin to the previous strip with right side spacing, and do the same for both sides now, because you will definitely be able to sew both sides at the same time. And then sew in place, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and do the same for both sides. Now press both of your sides open, finger press first, and then press with a nice hot iron. Now choose your next 2 strips, one for each side, and you'll see as we go along that these strips get shorter and shorter. So try and keep your very smallest pieces to use at the ends. Then place these 2 pieces in position, and if you like, you can pin in place. At your sewing machine, sew in position, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure they're lined up nicely if you haven't pinned, as I haven't on these ones. The next job is to cut down to your 6.5 inch square again. So on the wrong side, using a square ruler, the best size that you can find, mine I think is 8.5 inches, or it could be 9.5, but I'm trimming it down to 6.5 inches. So do your first side, turn it around, and then check that you've got 6.5 inches all around, and then cut across your next side, and then turn your piece of fabric round again, so 1/4 turn, and then you're ready to cut the next side. In fact, I will probably do 2 sides at once, so I'm going to cut across one side and down the other, making sure that I've got both sides marked at 6.5 inches. Cut across one side and then cut down the other side, and that should be a 6.5 inch square, and there you go, that's how it should look. If your foundation was paper, then you can now remove this paper, or you can save it up and remove all the foundations off all of your squares altogether. I personally like to do it one at a time because it's not a job I really like doing. Once you've made as many squares as you would like, it's time to group them into 4s and work out which you would like to go together. So sort them out. You want the triangle piece in the centres, and sort them out to how you think they would look best before sewing them. I went through the whole pile I'd done and sorted them all into groups of 4 before joining them all together. But it depends on what you're making. You might be just making a bag and you might not have too many to do, or you might be making a whole quilt, in which case you'll have a lot to do. Choose the first 4 squares you're going to sew together and fold the right hand side over the left hand side, and then we're going to sew down the right hand side, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you like, you can pin these together. Entirely up to you whether you want to pin or not. Then at your sewing machine, sew taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and do the same for both pieces. Before joining your 2 sets of 2 squares together, you need to press open the seam on each of your sets of 2 squares. Finger press them open first and then press with a hot iron. Normally you would press your seam to one side, but in this case, especially if you've used fabric as your foundation, you've got a lot of bulk there, so I find it best to press them open. Then with right sides together, place the top 2 pieces over the bottom 2 pieces and match up that central seam, and then pin in place, and then pin all the way along that top edge, ready for sewing. Then at your sewing machine, sew together taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing the pins as you go along, and this is how it will look. That's the first block completed, and you can do as many or as few as you like.